Hey guys, how is it going? So first of all, 1,000 pine points to slightly odd guy. And before we start, I want to make an official statement. As you all know, I recently required the official legal rights to give up pine points, and there have been some accusations that the whole thing is a scheme for me to sift the pine points out of Pine Creek, because the last time the person who received the first ever 1,000 pine points from me was none other than Nathan Ormond from Digital Gnosis. And some people actually now are claiming that Nathan doesn't actually exist. He is just a sock account created with advanced deepfake technology, and I'm just basically giving 1,000 pie points to myself. And it's true that me and Nathan were never filmed in the same room, but I completely denied all these baseless accusations. And as soon as it's going to be possible, then I will physically travel to the official headquarters of Digital Gnosis in Swansea, and we'll make sure to stream together in the same studio. But anyway, I was going through my last video, and I think it's absolutely horrible for basically two reasons. First of all, the audio is awful. I don't know, honestly, how anyone can be listening to that. But unfortunately, it's as good as I can get with my zero knowledge of how to record sound. So we'll have to deal with that. But the second, and it's much more important and I think much more substantive, is I happened to notice that I made a lot of statements that lack nuance and are just too broad generalizations. And I failed to provide clarification. And it's really interesting experience for me because so far, most of my internet presence has been me reacting to content that someone else produced, usually other videos. And if you actually know in advance what you are going to be critiquing, it's pretty easy to kind of prepare in advance exactly what you want to say. But for the first time, last time, I was actually producing my own original content. And apparently, it's very difficult to make sure to provide as much clarification kind of on the spot as is necessary. And I can absolutely imagine someone like me critiquing my last stream and really nitpicking some of the things that I said. And I just wanted to make sure that I don't do that again. And that actually gave me an idea for an interesting video, roughly on the same topic. Because the last time we were talking about the traditional authorship of the Gospels, and the basic message of the video was that it's very improbable that two statements are true at the same time. One, that the traditional Gospel authorship is true, and two, that the Gospels were written in the genre of Greco-Roman biography, because we can establish, looking at other works in the genre, that when authors of these works either were eyewitnesses themselves or they had access to eyewitnesses, they say so. And we, of course, don't find these claims in the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of Matthew, which is what I think very unexpected. But of course, we do find these kinds of statements in the Gospel of John and then in Acts of Apostles. So in the Gospel of John, there are specific eyewitness claims. There is the famous scene of Jesus' crucifixion, where blood and water comes out of Jesus' wound on his side, and then it says, "He who saw this has testified, so that you may also believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. And if anyone tells you that he lies, well, that guy is just full of it." The last part is my editorialization, but that's the basic idea, right? And then in the last chapter, which, by the way, a lot of scholars think were not the original ending of the gospel, and that the gospel actually originally ended at the end of chapter 20. I'm undecided on that personally, because I think the Gospel of John, there is internal evidence that it probably had a pretty complicated textual history. It's probably not the case that the author just wrote the whole thing from nothing. as an original work. There was probably some written sources that were incorporated into it. But nevertheless, in this last paragraph, in this last chapter, it says, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true." And then, of course, in the Acts of Apostles, there are the famous V passages. So the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, who are very probably written by the same author, both contain an introduction when the author is talking. It's not a part of the narration. The author never identifies himself by name, and he never indicates that he's using sources other than the Old Testament. So I think this is still unexpected, because if it was written in the genre of Greco-Roman biography, we would absolutely expect him to say that he's using the Gospel of Mark as a source, given how closely the Gospel of Luke is following it, and also given that maybe John Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark, is a character in the story. He shows up as a character. But nevertheless, there are these V passages. This is an example from chapter 16, which I think is the first instance where these V passages show up. And these describe events where the author supposedly was himself present. And this is exactly what we should find in eyewitness sources if they are written in the genre of Greco-Roman biography, which is great. That's exactly what we are looking for. But then the question is, why isn't this found in Mark and Matthew? Because Mark and Matthew are also supposedly written by an eyewitness, and they are supposedly sourced by an eyewitness source. But we don't find these kinds of claims there, even though it's all supposed to be the same genre, Greco-Roman historical biography, and in case of Acts, I guess, history. And I think some apologists might even bite the bullet and say, okay, fair enough. We think that these kinds of claims are massively expected. Let's just throw the traditional authorship of Mark and Matthew under the bus, and let's just say that the Gospels of Mark and Matthew were not written by eyewitnesses, but it's fine because we still have John and Acts that were either written by eyewitnesses or they are based on eyewitness testimony. So what's the problem? But here, I actually think there is an interesting issue, and it leads to an interesting dilemma, which I alluded to in the thumbnail to this video. So first of all, I want to show you some amazing eyewitness claims, right? So here we have the Gospel of Peter, the very last chapter right before the manuscript breaks. And it says, "But I, Simon Peter, and Matthew my brother, took our nets and went to the sea, and there was with us Levi, son of Alphaeus, whom the Lord." And this is the exact point in the manuscript where the manuscript is corrupted. It's pretty amazing, because if the manuscript happens to be corrupted like one line or two lines earlier, then we wouldn't have this eyewitness claim. But there are actually eyewitness claims everywhere in apocryphal literature. Here we have the introduction to the Gospel of Thomas. Here are the secret words of Jesus, the living, which Jesus the living spoke, and which were transcribed by Didymus Jude Thomas. So some pretty amazing claims here. The Gospel of Ebionites, as quoted by Epiphanius, there appeared a certain man named Jesus of about 30 years of age, who chose us. So that's a pretty good wee passage. Then we have the Gospel of the Savior, one of the fragments. And this is very Gnostic. It says, "When the world became as darkness before us, the apostles, we became as those in the immortal eons, with our eyes traversing all the eons and clothed with the power of our discipleship." So this is pretty similar to the wee passages in Acts of the Apostles, right? And then finally, the infancy Gospel of Thomas. "I, Thomas the Israelite, an Israelite, write you this account." So here we have eyewitness claims, right? The author is claiming to be present in the narrative. So what do we do with that? And of course, we can even quote this. "Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the command of the Lord our Savior, and of Christ Jesus our hope, to Timothy, my loyal child in the faith, Grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and Christ Jesus our Lord. That's, of course, the introduction to the first epistle to Timothy, which is actually considered non-authentic by Paul. And by the way, let me make a digression. Not because not many people know about this, so I thought it might be interesting to show you guys what I discovered. I don't know if you noticed. I definitely did. There are a lot of people who claim that various positions in biblical studies are supported by the majority of scholars or a consensus of scholars, which I take to be an even stronger claim. But there is almost never any data about it. It's just asserted. And if there is any data, then the people who have the data don't want to give don't want to give us the data, and they are just sitting on it. But here, when it comes to the authorship of the Pauline epistles, we actually do have at least some data, because in 2011 there was the British New Testament Conference, and in one of the segments, one of the speakers actually distributed ballots which asked the participants about the authorship of the Pauline epistles. There were apparently 109 participants, which doesn't sound like a lot, but I think it's a lot in New Testament studies, because you have to remember that there isn't that many New Testament scholars in the first place. British scholars were probably overrepresented, but as you can see, for example, for First and Second Timothy, majority of the scholars at that point in time didn't think it was written by Paul, and the people who did affirm it was written by Paul were in a pretty significant minority. And it's unfortunate that they didn't actually publish the ballots, right? So we only have the total numbers of votes for individual epistles, but we actually can't look at even anonymized data of how individual scholars voted, because I'm pretty confident that out of the 26 people who thought that the second epistle to Timothy is authentic, 23 of them also believe that the first epistle of Timothy is authentic. And I can tell you, I think, pretty clearly, like, what the ideological bent of those 20 or so people was. So I think the answers to these questions were correlated among the different scholars. But this is just an aside. And there is a digression inside the digression. I'm starting to sound like Epiphanius, who is very fond of doing this. But I was going recently through some early Christian literature, and I found this amazing quote. So, do you know how today apologists sometimes claim that, yeah, some of the Pauline epistles are pseudepigraphical? Because, for example, the style, the vocabulary, the way how they are written, philologically speaking, is very different from the epistles which are recognized as genuinely Pauline. But this is actually fine, because they were written by followers of Paul. They claimed to be Paul, but this wasn't actually considered deceptive. Well, I always find it hilarious when these kinds of apologetic claims can be traced to early Christian apologists. They have actually almost 2,000 years of history. So Origen actually realized that what he says, the diction and phraseology of specifically the Epistle of Hebrews, is very different from the authentic Pauline epistles. But then he says they are those of someone who remembered the apostolic teaching and wrote down at his leisure what had been said by his teacher. Therefore, if any church holds that this epistle is by Paul, let it be commanded for this. For not without reason have the ancients handled it down as Paul's. So pretty much exactly the same argument, right? Okay, it wasn't written by Paul, but this is fine because it was just written by one of his apostles. And the argument for that seems to be that that's why, like, this being written by Paul's disciples, it's why it was attached to the name of Paul in the first place, which of course isn't actually evidence, right? Because if your alternative hypothesis is that this is just a forgery, then it's very easy to imagine how it was attached to Paul's name in the first place. So this just seems to me like a wishful thinking and as rationalizations. And of course, it has been established that pseudepigraphica in the ancient world, so writing under someone else's name, was universally considered deceptive, and the people were called liars, and pseudepigraphical works were called lies. This is probably one of the biggest, and almost the only original academic contribution of Bart Ehrman to New Testament studies, because he actually shown that this wasn't an established practice. And if someone else tells you otherwise, then he's not correct. But that's just a digression about the Pauline authorship. But just to reiterate, just because we expect eyewitness claims in eyewitness sources, that doesn't, of course, mean that every text with an eyewitness claim is an eyewitness source. And I can absolutely imagine how thinking it about this way might seem massively unfair if you are well, not just a Christian, but specifically a Christian who thinks that something significant hangs on this, because then there are, of course, Christians who have no problem admitting that, or recognizing, I guess, that the Gospels were not written by the traditional authors, and this is fine. But I mean, I can see how this might be unfair, because it's basically doomed if you do, doomed if you don't, right? We need to see some eyewitness sources if the traditional authorship is correct and if the genre is Greco-Roman biography. But if we actually see some, we are just going to reject them, right? So there's no winning. But this is how historians think, right? Finding eyewitness sources where we would expect them doesn't settle the question of the authorship. It basically opens it up. It's a necessary condition, but it isn't a sufficient condition on its own. And this is pretty evident because there is a lot of falsely attributed works. Just look at New Testament Apocrypha, which is, I think, something that most Christians would agree with. And it's even the case that there are some ancient authors with all books actually being falsely attributed. So we have some writings, they are attributed to them, but we don't think that any of those writings were actually written by these people. In some cases, we know some titles of works that these people wrote, but they are actually lost. But in some cases, we just know the names, and we don't know what they actually wrote, and we don't have it. We just have the forgeries. But this whole thing essentially creates like a dilemma between internal evidence and external evidence. Because technically speaking, the external evidence for the traditional authorship in Mark and Matthew is better than it is for John and Acts. Because Papias of Hierapolis, an early 2nd century Christian author, presumably talks about them, right? It's disputed whether he's actually talking about the same text that we have today, but I think most Christian apologists would want to claim that this is the case. But the Luke and John, the Acts and the Gospel of John, being authored by these people, that's just first mentioned by authors starting from Irenaeus, some 50 or 90 years later, depending how you date Papias, right? But on the other hand, Mark and Matthew are also the two works which lack any explicit eyewitness claims, which is, again, massively unexpected if they are written in the genre of Greco-Roman biography. And the two works with better internal evidence, Acts, which has the we passages, and John, which claims to be sourced by an eyewitness, have worse external evidence because they are first only identified as authors by Irenaeus, right? So the main point, like the key takeaway from this video, is that if you feel free to throw Mark and Matthew under the bus and say, okay, the reason why we don't find any eyewitness claims there is because they were not written by eyewitnesses, then you need to essentially discard everything that the early Christian authors tell you about who wrote these books, starting from Papias, going to all the way to Irenaeus, and then everyone else. Because it's not like these two Gospels, the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, were attributed to someone else other than Mark or Matthew. As far as I know, that attribution is universal, right? So you would have to concede that every early Christian author who identifies these people as the authors is incorrect. And if they are all universally false about the authorship of Mark and Matthew, if they are just operating with false information, why think they are correct when it comes to Luke and John, especially given that the authorship of Acts and John has even worse attestation to begin with, again. And two, it's the same authors talking about all four Gospels, right? So it's not like we have some independent sources that attest to authorship of John and Acts, but not to Mark and Matthew. It boils down to the same people, starting from Irenaeus, right? And so this is essentially what I see as a dilemma. It's very interesting that technically speaking, the two Gospels that have better internal evidence, because they at least contain some eyewitness claims which we would expect, also have worse external evidence, because the authors are first identified like 50 or 90 years later. And the vice versa is true about Mark and Matthew. And let me just talk a little bit about evaluating sources of evidence, evaluating sources as evidence, because I think that people in general, when they are thinking about ancient history and how like contemporary historians look at it now, they tend to overemphasize the importance of how chronologically close the source is to the events, you know. And I think even non-theists do this. They, for example, insist on us having sources contemporary to the events. Otherwise, they just don't accept what the sources say. And I think this is because there is this meme going around. It's like this laundry list of various criteria which historians use for evaluating sources. And I think you've all heard it probably many times, right? Like sources that are chronologically closer to the events are better than sources that are later. First-hand sources are better than hearsay. Independent sources are, of course, better than dependent sources. Hostile sources are better than sympathetic sources, and so on and so forth. Which, yes, this is technically true, but it's a massive generalization, and we shouldn't just take it as a law, as a hard rule. Like, for example, last semester, I used to have I had a course in ancient historiography. And at the beginning of the first lecture, we were talking about these criteria, right? And we recognized that, yes, sources chronologically closer to the events are generally better. But then we spent the last of the entire course talking about how this is not always the case, and how sometimes sources that are pretty close to the events are actually historically worthless, and how sources written centuries or even thousands of years after the events might still be very, very historically valuable. And we have examples for both, right? For example, there are fantastical biographies of Alexander the Great, written by people who are actually eyewitnesses, who weren't there on the campaigns. They, for example, depict how Alexander met the Amazonians, which probably didn't happen. And the opposite example would be Suda, which is a 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia named after an author who probably didn't write it, ironically. But it's from the 10th century, so it sometimes talks about events as much as 1500 years removed from when it was written, right? But we still consider it a very valuable source. So let's just move on. So this is the chronology of the things that I was just talking about, right? The absolute dates are not that important. What's important is the distance between the different dates. And again, just to reiterate, the earliest attestation to the authorship of Mark and Matthew is significantly earlier than the earliest attestation to Luke and John. So if you are happy to just throw the traditional authorship of Mark and Matthew under the bus, then I think you are in trouble, because you would have to concede that every author, starting from Papias, then going through Irenaeus and so on, had incorrect information about it. But it's the same people who then turn around and tell you who wrote Luke and John. And a second digression that I want to make is about how apologists sometimes like to talk about Gospels having much better authorial attestation than authorial attestation for other ancient works, right? This is the kind of argument that if you don't believe this, then you would have to just throw up all of ancient history, right? Throw away all of ancient history, which I'm not married to ancient history, so what's the problem with that, right? Like, is this supposed to be some appeal to adverse consequences? But fair enough, right? I think in most cases, this is true. It's true that the various New Testament books do have better authorial attestation than some, and maybe even most, other works from antiquity. But there's a reason for it. There's a very good reason for it. It's not surprising, right? And it's because Christianity became popular. So the works of early Christian authors were copied and they survived, while maybe other works in ancient literature, where originally this authorial attestation was found, didn't survive. And in some cases, we have like pretty good idea what those lost works were. Just to, like think about it. If Christianity died at some point, it just died out, right? Disappeared. Do we really think we would know about Papias and about what he wrote about the Gospels? Probably not, right? Like Christianity won, and we even don't have his complete works. We just have fragments from it. So I think it's very plausible to imagine that the popularity of Christianity had something to do with why the attestation is so good. But let's just do a little exercise in like ancient historiography, and let's compare the Gospels to Plutarch. I just picked Plutarch because he's an ancient historian and philosopher, and he wrote a very large amount of works. And he's one of the authors where, luckily, very large amounts of what he wrote survive. Like his body of literature actually amounts for a fairly significant percentage, or at least a fraction of a percent, of the total body of ancient literature that we have today. There isn't that many authors like that where this is the case. And I picked Plutarch specifically because he, among other things, wrote historical biographies, and because Mike Lacona talks about him a lot. So let's just look at the attestation to the traditional authorship of the Gospels, and then let's compare it to attestation to the authorship of Plutarch's works. So here's the timeline. Yeah, this is just the thumbnail. I think it's pretty hilarious. This is the full timeline, right? So before I just showed you Papias and Irenaeus, but this is the whole thing. So again, the absolute chronology is not important. What's important are the distances between these different works. So these are the early Christian works that mention the Gospels, or at least it seems that they do. It seems they are working with some material that can be maybe sourced, goes back to the Gospels. In some cases, they say that they are quoting the Gospel, but it's actually interesting that for the earliest works, which we have in gray, it seems they are using some Gospel material, but they don't actually say who the author of the Gospel was. Then we have Papias and Justin Martyr, which are like special cases, right? Because Papias, as I mentioned, he doesn't actually quote from the Gospels. He just gives them some authors, but it's disputed whether what he's talking about are actually the Gospels that we have today. And it's not just this is just not disputed by critical scholars. I actually think that, for example, Mike Lacona believes, and I don't have him on record, but there are some other things that he said which lead me to this conclusion. I think Mike Lacona thinks that specifically the text that Papias identifies as the Gospel of Matthew is a different work than the Gospel of Matthew that we have today. Well, Mike Lacona thinks probably that it's the Q source. He probably thinks that the Q source was written by Matthew, and this is the text that Papias is talking about, and that the Gospel of Matthew was probably not written by the Gospel of Matthew, but it was just written by some of Matthew's followers, and it incorporated this information from the Q source, which goes all the way back to Matthew. Again, I don't have him on record about this, but I think this is what he believes. So then we have Justin Martyr, who quotes some gospel material, I think from the Gospel of Mark. He calls it Memoirs of the Apostles, but he doesn't give any names. And then starting from Irenaeus, we have later Christian authors who do talk about the Gospels and give them the names that we have today. Here's like just a selection of important people. It's not exhaustive, just important that Irenaeus is the first one. Sometimes this fact that the earliest sources who seem to use the Gospel material don't actually name the sources. They don't say Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke. Sometimes this is used as evidence against traditional authorship. And the argument is, if these names were attached to the texts from the very beginning, then we would expect these authors to name the authors, right? We would expect, for example, First Clement to say the Gospel of Matthew, or the Epistle of Barnabas, say the Gospel of Matthew. But that's not what we find. I don't actually think this is a very strong argument, because this is exactly what we find in later authors as well, right? Like if you look at later authors, yeah, they sometimes say that they are quoting from the Gospel of Matthew, but more often than not, they actually just quote the Gospel, and they don't tell you which Gospel they are quoting. And sometimes they even don't tell you that they are quoting anything at all, right? So it could be the case. It's not improbable that the names were attached to the manuscripts from the very beginning, and the reason why these early sources don't mention any names is just because they happened to quote them the same way as later authors quoted them, which means usually without any authorial attestation. And also, like these earlier sources quote the Hebrew Bible, and they don't tell you which exact book they are quoting, right? They will say the scripture says, or they will say the prophets say, but they won't actually tell you, Isaiah says, for example. So I don't think that's such a strong argument. But okay, like this is how it looks like for the Gospels. Let's look at Plutarch now. By the way, there is one important point that I wanted to make, right? So if we go back one step, I mentioned that it seems that these early sources, so the sources in gray, are using some gospel material, but this is actually not certain, and there are actually disagreements about scholars, because in some cases it looks like the similarity to the text of the Gospels that we have today is not very strong. And in some cases, some of those passages actually look like it's several Gospels mixed together, right? So here's an example from the first epistle of Clement, probably not written by Clement, right? It's considered anonymous. And I just color-coded 3 passages, 2 from the Gospel of Matthew and 1 from the Gospel of Luke, which are identified as gospel material. Some scholars even throw in Gospel of Mark as well, right? So it's actually very difficult to establish that the author of the first Clement, the first epistle of Clement, actually used Gospels as a source. It could be the case that he did, but the text of the Gospels that he was using was significantly different from the text of the Gospels that we have today. That's an interesting possibility. Or it could be the case that this is actually independent from the Gospels, and the parallels, like the verbal parallels, are not because any genetic link between these 2 works, but it's because this was just vocabulary that the early Christians were using, right? And this is an example where it's very, very difficult to determine with a very high degree of credence that one piece of literature is using another piece of literature as a source, right? So if we compare it to what I showed you the last time, what we have above is the Gospel of Mark, and then on the right, the parallel passage in the Gospel of Matthew. And as you can see, it's pretty clearly we can pretty clearly establish that the Gospel of Matthew used the Gospel of Mark as a source, right? Because the verbal parallels are pretty extreme. But if you compare it to the 2 passages below, where we have first Clement and then the Gospel of Luke, not so much. So I don't think the case is as strong. But anyway, so let's just go back to what we are doing right now, right? So we are comparing early authorial attestation of the canonical Gospels with the authorial attestation to the works of Plutarch. So this is how it looks like for the Gospels. And now I will start adding sources for Plutarch. So by the way, Plutarch lived in the 1st and 2nd century CE. He is usually dated, like his death is usually dated to around 120 CE, which means he would be contemporary with the Gospel authors, actually. So that's a fairly close so that's a fairly good analogy, right? So it seems that the first author who's actually mentioning Plutarch as a person is Apuleius, who was a Latin-speaking, Latin-writing author. He was born probably shortly after Plutarch's death, and he died probably in 70s, so around 170. So he wrote about 40 to 60 years after Plutarch's death. he doesn't say that Plutarch wrote anything. He just claims that he is, well, the character in the story, right? It's supposedly autobiographical, but this is the character of the story speaking, not necessarily the author. The character of the story claims that his descendant, he's a descendant of Plutarch. One of his ancestors was Plutarch. Then we have another source, which we think actually uses some of the works of Plutarch, including his historical biography as a source, but he doesn't say that. His name is Polyaenus, and he wrote what's called strategemata, which is a technical genre of literature. It's essentially a treatise about military strategy, right? It's translated as stratagems in English. He doesn't cite Plutarch as a source. In fact, as far as I know, he doesn't cite any of his sources. But that's fine because he's not writing history. He's writing a different genre. Strategemata are usually it consists of very large number, dozens of small, short anecdotes, mostly about famous generals and soldiers. But there's, for example, a section about the role of women in the war and like brave deeds that women did in various wars. And these short stories or short like anecdotes and summaries of events serve as examples of some innovative, clever tactics, strategies, what to do during sieges of cities. And they, of course, also serve as examples of moral virtues that are associated with war, like courage, for example. And how do we know that he's using Plutarch as a source if he doesn't say it right? Well, it's a cumulative case. And the point is that if you actually go through the work, and this is what I color-coded here, a lot of the anecdotes that he gives are very similar or almost exactly identical to anecdotes that are found in Plutarch. And in some cases, only in Plutarch, right? And if there was just maybe one or two or a small number of them, we could still think that, yeah, probably this is independent. Like it could be the case that these anecdotes were just circulating around, or it could be the case that they were both using different sources. But it's just so many of them that most scholars think pretty obviously, and this is not like very controversial, that this is an author who used Plutarch as a source. And then we can start mentioning people who explicitly quote Plutarch as an author. So actually, they tell us something about what he wrote. And as far as I was able to find, the earliest author like that is called Aulus Gellius, who wrote a compilation of various bits and pieces from ancient literature. And he just actually, like the very first thing that he says in the opening paragraph, he mentions Plutarch, and he gives us information about some of his writings. And we even have attestation of the lives of Plutarch, specifically the biographies that he wrote. There are two authors, Diogenes Laertius, who wrote biographies of philosophers, and he uses Plutarch quite a lot. And then we have an anonymous source about rhetoric, which is attributed to Menander the rhetorician, but it wasn't probably written by him. So again, we have a false authorial attestation. And this source also mentions Plutarch's lives. So if we actually add it to the timeline, it looks like this. So above the timeline, we have all of the people who talk about, or all the sources that talk about authorial, they use some gospel material, right? Regardless of whether they say who the authors are or not. And in case of Papias, they just tell us who wrote the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, presumably, but they don't actually quote, he doesn't actually quote from it. And below the timeline is the corresponding date for the authors that I was talking about, right? So Apuleius and Polyaenus were writing roughly 40 to 60 years after Plutarch's death. Diogenes Laertius was probably written, we don't know that for sure, during the reign of Alexander Severus, so that would be about 100 and 120 years after Plutarch's death. And then the text that is attributed to Menander is again, it's very difficult to say when it was written, but I've seen it dated to the reign of Diocletian, so that would be about 160 to 180 years after Plutarch's death. And if you actually compare it against the Gospels, not so bad, right? So if you want to say the Gospels have amazing authorial attestation, it's so much better than anything else that we have in ancient history. You are probably right, but Plutarch wouldn't be a good example to give. And I think this is not very significant because, as I mentioned, the reason why we don't have that many sources below the chart, below the timeline, is because, Christianity won. It became popular. So, of course, there is probably a disproportionate amount of Christian literature written specifically, which was preserved because Christianity became popular, right? And I think we are really lucky that we have such a good authorial attestation for the works of Plutarch, because Plutarch happened to live in one of the peaks of Greek and Roman literary production. It's called the Silver Age. And for authors who wrote, for example, significantly later, like during the crisis of the 3rd century, the authorial attestation is going to be really bad because almost nothing survived the crisis of the 3rd century. Very little, right? Suddenly, the body of literature that survives is much, much smaller. Some historians actually think that this is because during the crisis of the 3rd century, there wasn't that much literature written in the first place. Like they think that literary production went down because you had a crisis which lasted the whole century, right? Earlier in Roman history, you had the year of the 3 emperors, which coincidentally was also the summer of 69. But during the crisis of the 3rd century, you had the year of the 5 emperors and even the year of the 7 emperors. So as you can see, the Roman Empire was in deep crisis, and it's possible that people just didn't write that much, right? But anyway, it seems that we have just much less. Okay, so that was the end of this digression, and let's get back to the original point, right? So eyewitness claims are expected in eyewitness sources, especially in Greco-Roman historical biography, and I can just flood you with examples. And what's really interesting is that these examples will basically cover almost all of the historians that are preserved, and we think they were actually eyewitnesses or could have access to eyewitnesses, right? It's very difficult to find like blind spots where what I'm saying isn't actually true. We find some authorial claims, some eyewitness claims in John and Acts, but not in Mark and Matthew. If you want to throw Mark and Matthew under the bus, then you would have to throw out all of the authors who attribute the Gospels to them. But then, why should you trust the same authors when they are talking about John and Acts, right? It's clear that they have false information. And this is even worse because the traditional authorship of Mark and Matthew goes back even further. It technically has like better external evidence. It goes to Papias, which is chronologically closer to when the Gospels were written, while in case of Luke and John, it only starts with Irenaeus, right? And by the way, and this is probably what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about, there are some other problems with early Gospel attestation, right? So again, Christian apologists will tell you the evidence for the traditional authorship is just so amazing. It's much, much better than what we have for almost anything else in Greco-Roman literature. And if you don't accept the traditional authorship of the Gospels, you would have to throw out all of history and just be completely like postmodern cultural neo-Marxist about what happened in the past. But I think actually the external evidence for the traditional Gospel authorship is pretty bad. And this is probably a topic for a separate video, but I want to actually talk about it, right? Definitely at some point I will stream about the problems with early Christian tradition, because it's all over the place, right? You will find wildly contradictory and inconsistent claims, which, fair enough, it shouldn't surprise us, but I think it's very striking given how strong the early Christian authors themselves claim is the link between them and the events that they are reporting, right? Like, for example, Irenaeus claims that he spoke and he heard from Polycarp, who supposedly was a disciple of John, a disciple of Jesus. So here, in theory, we have like a pretty good channel of information, right? But then the same Irenaeus, for example, seems to think that Jesus was crucified under the reign of Claudius when he was almost 50. And he thinks this is theologically insignificant, right? So it wasn't irrelevant for them. It was for him. It was actually a very important point. So, like on one hand, you have all these problems of early Christian authors being all over the place about all kinds of things, and on the other hand, they claim that they have like such a good sources, and they have like such a strong tradition where you can like very clearly track who was a disciple of who. But anyway. One of the things that this early Christian tradition is very inconsistent about is the traditional gospel authorship. And more specifically, this early Christian tradition seems to be false, seems to be incorrect about essentially everything that we can establish is true about the Gospels, except for the traditional authorship, right? So if there is a claim that we can actually check today, because we have critical scholarship. And then we look at what early Christian authors were saying about the claim. We think that their information is false, right? And let me just give you some examples. And I'm just going to read it, and you think about what isn't right about this, right? Like if you think, if you know a little bit about New Testament studies, you will probably pick this out immediately, right? So we have Papias, as quoted by Eusebius. Matthew put together the oracles in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best as he could. Then we have Irenaeus. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. Then we have Origen. I have learned by tradition that the gospel according to Matthew, who was at one time a publican and afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, was written first, and that he composed it in the Hebrew tongue and published it for the converts from Judaism. And then finally we have Eusebius himself, for Matthew, who had at first preached to the Hebrews and he was about to go to other peoples, committed his gospel to writing in his native tongue. So what's wrong with this? Well, there are like three things that are wrong with it, right? So first of all, it claims that the Gospel of Matthew is the first gospel written, which we now know is false. Mark was the first gospel written, and the scholarly consensus for Markan authorship is overwhelming. I'm not providing any data, so I'm actually doing what I'm criticizing other people for doing. But hey, if they don't provide any data, why should I? Then the second problem is that it says that the Gospel of Matthew, and it says that very unambiguously, was originally written in Hebrew, which we know is not true. It was actually written in Greek. Doesn't make any sense as a translation from Hebrew to Greek. There are specific philological reasons for thinking that it was written in Greek first. And if it was translated from Hebrew, it would be worded very differently. And then there is, of course, the additional third issue with Origen, who claims, and other people claim that after him as well, for example, Jerome, that the author of the Gospel of Matthew wasn't just named Matthew. He was also the publican, the tax collector from Galilee, the apostle personally handpicked by Jesus. But there are critical scholars who reject this. I think one of them is actually Michael Licona. I think Michael Licona thinks that this authorial attestation is false. That, Q was written by Matthew, the tax collector, but the gospel itself wasn't written by Matthew. And if this is the case, I would care to guess that one of the reasons why Michael Licona thinks this is because he realizes that it's very, very implausible that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew. But then the Gospel of Matthew never actually says that, right? That's massively unexpected. And also, he probably realizes that if the Gospel of Matthew was just written by Matthew, well, Matthew would produce an original work. He wouldn't have to model it word for word in many instances after the Gospel of Mark. Because again, That's something that we never see in ancient literature. We don't actually have any examples of two works from Greco-Roman literature that are so similar as the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, right? Like if this wasn't about the Bible, I think some scholars would probably just consider it two different versions of the same work, just very, very like divergent versions, right? But they would maybe consider it the same work. So yeah, that's the third issue. Then we have early Christian authors who actually believed that the Gospel of John is dependent on the Synoptic Gospels, right? This is what I think as well, but I think a lot of Christian apologists specifically want to reject this claim. They want to claim that John actually didn't know about the Synoptic Gospels. They want to say that it's not the case that the Gospel of John read the Synoptic Gospels before he wrote his own Gospel, because that gives them one additional independent source. But the problem is, this is not what we found in early Christian tradition. In early Christian tradition, in a number of cases, it specifically says that the author of the Gospel of John, John the Apostle, read the synoptics first and then decided to write his Gospel. For example, Eusebius says, and when Mark and Luke had already published their Gospels, they say that John, who had employed all his time in proclaiming the Gospel orally, finally proceeded to write for the following reason. The three Gospels already mentioned having come into the hands of all and into his own too. So again, here it's pretty unambiguous that he had the Synoptic Gospels in his hand. They say that he accepted them and bore witness to their truthfulness, because of course he did, right? Like we can't have the Gospel authors disagreeing among each other. Of course he verified them. But that there was lacking in them an account of the deeds done by Christ at the beginning of his ministry. Right? So here we have an early Christian author who says that the author of the Gospel of John, knew about the synoptics before he started writing, so it's not independent. So again, if you want to claim that the Gospel of John is independent from the synoptics, you have to throw this out. You have to start ignoring early Christian tradition. And by the way, like one small point about this, I don't buy this, right? I do think that the Gospel of John was aware of the synoptics, but I don't buy this story. And I think it's actually pretty obvious why this story was being circulated and why Eusebius decided to include it in his own work. And that's because of apologetics. I think this story developed for apologetical reasons. Specifically, it developed as counter-apologetics against the claims that the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John are actually in contradiction. And the reason why I think that is because of what Eusebius says just a couple of lines below. He says, one who understands this, meaning the reason why John wrote his Gospels the way he did, can no longer think that the Gospels are at variance with one another, or in other words, in contradiction, inasmuch as the Gospel according to John contains the first acts of Christ, while the others give an account of the latter part of his life. And the genealogy of our Savior according to the flesh, John quite naturally omitted, because it had already been given by Matthew and Luke, right? So I think this story about John knowing about the synoptics, authenticating them, verifying them, saying that they are okay, and then writing a very different gospel, a gospel that reads very differently, actually was apologetic, right? It was created and circulated as an explanation, the harmonization of the different gospels. Because there were people running around, and we are going to see that, who actually thought that the gospels are contradictory, right? And they even rejected the Gospel of John as scripture. Then there are some contradictions. For example, was Peter still alive when Mark wrote his Gospel? So remember, the Gospel of Mark supposedly has Peter as a source. So was Peter still alive, or was he already dead? it depends on which early Christian author you read, right? So, for example, Irenaeus says, and there, after there means Peter's and Paul's departure, which means their martyrdom. Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. So here it pretty explicitly says that Mark wrote after Peter was already dead. But Eusebius says, and I'm not going to quote it at length, that Peter was still alive. And actually, when he learned about it, on learning what had been done through the revelation of the Spirit, it is said that the apostle was delighted with the enthusiasm of the men and sanctioned the composition for reading in the churches. So here we have a different picture. Mark actually wrote the gospel while Peter was still alive. He found out about it through a revelation of the Spirit, not because someone told him, hey, there is a gospel and it was written by one of your disciples. And when he found out about it, he said that this is okay. Again, it's not difficult to see why this story exists and why it was circulated. It's apologetic, right? It basically certifies the authority of the Gospel of Mark. It says, okay, this wasn't written by Peter, but it's okay because Peter knew about it. He was okay with it. He sanctioned the reading of the gospel in churches. So don't worry about it. You can move on with your Christian lives. And then, of course, we have the authorship of the Gospel of John. So sometimes apologists will tell you that the authorship of the Gospels is universal, that we don't actually have any competing hypotheses. There aren't any different authors that the Gospels were attributed to. But this is false. The Gospel of John was attributed, as far as I'm able to count, to at least 4 different people, right? This isn't the case for Plutarch. This isn't the case for Plato. So who are these 4 people? Well, the first and obvious example was John, the apostle, son of Zebedee, the brother of James, by whom the Gospel of John and the Catholic epistle was written. This is what Dionysius, one of the earliest Christian authors, says. He's quoted by Eusebius. But then we have a different gospel, different John, author of the same gospel, supposedly, John, the disciple of the Lord, in Irenaeus. Some New Testament scholars think that the Gospel of John wasn't actually written by John the Apostle, John, son of Zebedee, but by a different John. And one of the New Testament scholars who think that is, yeah boy, Richard Bauckham, right? So according to Richard Bauckham, the Gospel of John wasn't written by John, son of Zebedee. It was actually written by a different John, who was a disciple, but not an apostle. And what's really interesting about this specific passages in Irenaeus is that Irenaeus calls the apostles, right? He calls Peter the apostle, Matthew the apostle, but he never calls John the apostle. The John, specifically the author of the Gospel of John, which I think is the reason to think that he probably means a different person, right? He doesn't think it's John, son of Zebedee. So that's the second guy, right? So we have John, the son of Zebedee, a different John, also disciple of Jesus, but not John, son of Zebedee. Then we have a third John. So there is a thing called the anti-Marcionite prologues to the Gospels. They are found attached to, I think, some early Gospel manuscripts. And it actually gives a really hilarious story about how the Gospel of John was written. And I'm going to read it because it's interesting. The Gospel of John was revealed and given to the churches by John while still in the body. He was still alive. Just as Papias of Hierapolis, the close disciple of John, related in the Exoterics? Yeah. Okay. This is in the last 5 books. That is in the last 5 books. Indeed, he wrote down the gospel while John was dictating carefully. So here we have Papias actually writing down the Gospel of John, but John was dictating it to him. But who this John was, that's a really good question, right? But the heretic Marcion, after being condemned by him, because he was teaching the opposite to him, meaning John, was expelled by John, but he, meaning Marcion, had brought writings or letters to him, meaning John, from the brothers which were in Pontus. So here we have a third author. His name is also John, but he was still alive when Marcion was around. And Marcion was excommunicated from the church in 140s, in the middle of the 2nd century, right? So it can't be John, son of Zebedee, unless he was like 140 years old and still kicking around, dictating the Gospels and excommunicating people. And it can't be John, a disciple of Jesus, but not John, the son of Zebedee, because that guy would still be dead, right? Like everyone who could have been a disciple of Jesus, an eyewitness to Jesus, would be dead in the middle of the 2nd century. So we have a third guy named John, a third potential candidate for the authorship of the Gospel of John. But then we have a fourth guy, because there was actually a group of early Christians who rejected the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation. And they actually believed that these works were not written by any John. They were written by a guy named Cerinthus, or Cerinthos, who is one of the early Christian heretics. So we have 4 different people. 3 of them are named John, but they are not the same guy. And then we have a 4th author who has a completely different name, right? You can find all of these claims in early Christian literature. So just to reiterate, imagine if there was a work attributed to Plutarch, but within some 300 years after Plutarch's death, it was also attributed to 3 different people. It was unclear who this Plutarch was supposed to be, just as it's unclear whether Matthew, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, tax collector from Galilee. The sources making the authorial claims were also wrong about virtually everything else that we can tell about the work. For example, the language in which it was written in, right? Then I think scholars would absolutely doubt it. And scholars do actually doubt authorship of the works of Plutarch. There are many works that were attributed to Plutarch, but were not actually written by him. And there is some evidence that there were forgeries written by Plutarch's name as early as 2nd century. So very shortly after he died, people were already circulating forgeries in his name. And if you actually look at reasons that the scholars give for rejecting the authorship of Plutarch for these specific works, it's much less severe than the problems that I have just gave you. This is why I think that the early gospel attestation is actually terrible. I think if any other work in antiquity had the same quality of authorial attribution, scholars would doubt it, and they would be correct for doubting it, right? They would be right. So yeah, but that's just a story for another time. Okay, so let's switch gears, and now for something completely different. We are getting to the last segment of my stream, where I want to talk about a completely different thing, which is not related to New Testament studies or biblical studies at all, but it's just an opportunity for me to geek about it and maybe crack some jokes. And what I want to talk about is this. And this is something that almost nobody knows about or nobody realizes, right? But did you guys know that almost all of ancient Greek and Roman myths actually take place at roughly the same time? So many of the characters, especially the heroes of Greco-Roman literature, lived around the same time, and they actually could meet each other, and they very frequently met each other. And ancient Greeks, of course, had very sophisticated chronologies of ancient mythology, because they naturally considered ancient myths actual history. So they calculated when the various events in ancient history took place. So they could, for example, tell you exactly in which year Zeus was born, or when Dionysus was born for the first time. In some cases, for example, the birth of Zeus, there is even a specific date. I think it's 20th of August, but I'm not exactly sure. But you can celebrate the birthday of Zeus if you want to. But yeah, this is just some events from ancient mythology that I picked out. I think it should be fairly like representative of all of the events, right? So, of course, you have the very distant past when the world was created. It's around 1800 BCE, so almost 4,000 years ago. Then you have some events surrounding that. So the Titanomachia, right? The war between the Titans and the Olympian gods, the first sacrifice, Prometheus stealing the fire, him being chained. And then you have some really early, like first generation, essentially, early generation of mythical heroes. You have, of course, the flood, because Greeks had a flood story. Deucalion was their Noah. They actually claim there were multiple floods, and that we have like different names of different people who are essentially functioning as Noah in the stories. But the most popular one was Deucalion and his wife Pirha. And we have Perseus, who lived, I think, about 2 or 3 generations before everyone else, and Cadmus, who was the founder of Thebes, who surprisingly shows up also much later in myths, which take place like generations after his death, right? So how is it the case that Cadmus, who was supposed to be dead, was still alive? Well, of course there was a harmonization, right? Because there always is a harmonization. Some ancient mythographers just said, well, it's not a contradiction that Cadmus shows up here and also 3 generations later, right? It's not a mistake in chronology. It's just he was so virtuous that God prolonged his life. So he lived much, much longer than everyone else. And that's why he shows up as a character, for example, in some of the later stories. But then bulk of the events actually takes place roughly in, let's say, 14th to 13th century. And it ends with the Trojan War, more or less. And then you have Nostoi, the returns of the various heroes from Troy. And we have many, many examples where actually the Greek heroes meet each other. There are like crossovers between their stories, which gave me this amazing idea that I want to pursue. And it's this: Hellenikos Kinematikos Kosmos, or in English, the Greek cinematic universe. Because we can actually just sketch a bulk of Greek mythology as these movies, and it would have pretty similar structure. Because, as I mentioned, there are stories where only some heroes participate in, but then there are these like crossover events where almost everyone meets at the same time, right? So Phase 0 would be your equivalent to movies like Blade, which took place before MCU or were made before MCU, right? And that would include your Prometheus, Perseus, Cadmus, and so on. Then you will have Phase 1, and the large Avengers event would be the hunt for the Caledonian Boar, which is what I want to talk about later. Then in Phase 2, you would have maybe some stories about Heracles. You would have some stories about Theseus, about Oedipus. This is, by the way, not like exactly chronologically correct, right? So I just threw this together because I thought it's funny. So it could be the case some of the stories actually don't line up chronologically, but whatever, right? Definitely the second Avengers movie would be the Quest for the Golden Fleece, because almost everyone who was a superhero, or at least a hero, heros, in ancient Greek at the time, became an Argonaut and went with Jason or Jason to Colchis to retrieve the Golden Fleece. And then in Phase 3, we have the culmination of the story, and that's the 2 sieges of war of Troy. Because I don't know if you know about it, Troy wasn't sieged and conquered just once. It was actually conquered twice. And the famous story, of course, is the 10-year siege of Troy with Achilles, Hector, and so on. That everyone knows that, right? But Troy was actually destroyed even earlier, and it was destroyed by Heracles, who, of course, did that almost entirely single-handedly because he's just amazing. And it was also motivated, by, at least partially, by a kidnapping. of Helen. So Helen was actually kidnapped twice. She was kidnapped by Paris, but she was kidnapped even earlier by Theseus of the Minotaur fame. He wanted to take her as a wife. She was 12 years old, by the way, when he kidnapped her, and she gave him a child. So that's pretty creepy stuff. But yeah, like during those events, Troy was sieged down and it was destroyed by Heracles. But today I want to talk about the first Avenger event, which is the hunt for the Caledonian boar, depicted here by a later Roman piece of art. And it's really interesting because basically all of the events, like all of the heroes, participated in it. At least the heroes from the earlier generation. The only exception, or the major exception, is Heracles. Heracles probably didn't participate in it because he was just so much better than everyone else that if he participated, he would just kill the boar, right? There is a tendency in ancient literature to explain away why Heracles is not present during some events, even though he could have been, because if he was present, there wouldn't be any conflict. He was just so powerful that he would completely decide it. And this is exactly the same kind of problem that the Marvel movies have today, right? Like you can always just ask, oh, why don't the Avengers call Thor? Because he can just like kill everyone with his hammer and his like lightning powers, Or now you have even a bigger problem, which is Captain Marvel, right? Like she's basically the Superman. So you always need to come up with these more or less convoluted explanations, and sometimes no explanations at all, for why they are not there. Exactly the same thing in ancient Greek myths, right? Why is Heracles not there? Well, because if he was, there wouldn't be any conflict. So who was actually there? Well, we have the hero of the story, Meleagros, who was kind of like Captain America, just because he's the main hero of the story and he kind of brought everyone together. I should probably tell you like what the plot of the story is, right? So there is a guy named Oineus, which literally means the wine man. He's sometimes credited as the first person who like produced wine, right? Either he came up with it or it was the gift from the gods. But one day he forgot to sacrifice to goddess Artemis, who of course sent a monstrous boar to the country of Caledon, and it was just wreaking havoc. It was a complete ruckus. And so Oineus' son, Meleagros, pictured here as Captain America, just called all these heroes and they participated, right? There was a problem because one of them was a female, Atalante. It's one of the female warriors of Greece. And some heroes didn't want to fight because they thought it's disgraceful to fight alongside a woman. Atalante, by the way, has a really interesting story of her own. For example, when she was a baby, she was suckled by Artemis herself, and Artemis was in a form of a she-bear. So pretty weird, right? But anyway, Atalante just participated in the hunt. Anyway, she actually wounded the boar, and Meleagros then finished it off. But he actually gave the trophy to her. And again, some heroes, particularly Meleagros' uncles, protested against the prize being given to a female. So Meleagros killed them. But there was a problem because he then was assassinated, essentially, or murdered by his own wife for killing his own uncles. And he was killed in a really interesting way, right? Because when he was born, when he was an infant, the fates, the Morai, prophesied that he will live as long as a specific piece of wood that was burning at that point in time in the family hearth unless that piece of wood is consumed by fire, right? So if the piece of wood is fine, he's going to be alive, potentially indefinitely. But as soon as you take the piece of wood and you burn it, he's going to drop that immediately, which is exactly what happens, right? Because his mother, realizing that the piece of wood is important, hid it, and she was hiding it the whole time. But when she actually got pissed at Meleagros because he killed his own uncles, she just took the piece of wood, he threw it into the fire, and Meleagros immediately dropped dead. And that's how Artemis got revenge on King Oeneas in the first place, because the events resulted in the death of his own son. So this is the hero of the story, main hero of the story. Then we have Jason or Jason, who I kind of think about as Iron Man, and just because he has the ship Argo, which is like a technical gimmick, right? He didn't build it; it was built by a ship architect, a shipbuilder named Argos, I think, Argus. But yeah, it's a piece of technology. Essentially, it talks. It's a talking ship, so kind of similar to January in no, January is from Prey, right? What was the name of Friday? The AI in the suit. So this would be Jason. Then another guy who participated in it was Theseus. I imagine him as Thor because he is depicted in this statue in a similar posture. Then they were the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, Castor and Polydeuces in Greek. They were twin heroes. They were actually, I don't know if you know about it, but they were hatched from an egg, and they were siblings of Helena, of the Troy fame. You know, she was the one being kidnapped, and she was the reason for the Trojan War. And Helena was actually also hatched from an egg, from a different egg, and she also had a twin hatched from the same egg, Clytemnestra, who was the wife of Agamemnon, and she killed him after he came from Troy. So here they are pictured as Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. And yes, I just copy-pasted the same statue, but they are twins, so nobody should know this. And then we have two other twins, actually, because there were all kinds of twins in ancient mythology, the most famous ones being probably Castor and Polydeuces, right? But there is Idas and Idas was a giant, and Lycneus had a perfect sight. His sight was so good he could actually see even underground, which is pretty handy, if you ask me. Then there is a guy named Ancaios who supposedly killed his enemies by breaking their ribs. He just like grabbed them and like broke their ribs, right? I couldn't find any ancient or modern or like later depiction of him, but I kind of think about him as Drax the Destroyer, and Drax is pretty hilarious. So there you go. And then there was, of course, Atalante, here being depicted as the most amazing female superhero, Megasonic Teenage Warhead, right? Yeah. And that's it. That's the whole thing. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm significantly less nervous this time, so maybe I can answer some. How did you guys like it? How is the audio and everything? Can anyone actually hear me? Let's give it a go. At some point, I will probably do an after show on Discord, but not today. I need to do my Greek homework and maybe read a little bit. It seems to me the YouTube chat is actually dead. Yeah, okay. Some people think it was super cool. Thanks very much. So again, like and subscribe. That's going to make me feel significantly better about myself, and I won't probably end up deleting this channel out of embarrassment. And just let me know in the comments if there are any specific topics that you want me to talk about. Actually, in last time, someone mentioned that he would like me to talk about the decline of the Roman Empire. What are some reasons behind it? And interestingly enough, this semester I'm actually taking a course on late Roman history, and this is exactly what we are talking about. And what I've been doing so far, and the reason why I'm doing it is because I haven't seen anyone do that, is I'm basically taking the various factors like economic, political, and social factors, which are cited either in primary or secondary literature as being part of the causal chain that eventually led to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And I'm basically linking them in a causal chain, right? So in the end of the causal chain, you have the fall of the Western Roman Empire, specifically King Odoacer dethroning Romulus Augustulus and not bothering to appoint any successor. And from there goes like a web of different causes that all contributed to it. And I think it's really, really interesting. I think not many people know that much about it. I can tell you right now that the three causes for the fall of the Western Roman Empire was fascism, racism, and unequal wealth distribution, which should probably tell you a lot about my political opinions. But hey, I have this very well evidenced. So thanks, guys, for stopping by.